So the question we're asking is, is this a neoliberal idea, counter-radicalization? Is this, given that it is very prominent in neoliberal states, is this a result of neoliberal economic structures? There's a load of research in criminology that identifies a relationship between your political and economic base and your structure for punishment. It's fantastic developed literature. So there's Bernard Harcourt's work on neoliberalism and Loïc Wacquant, that if you have a neoliberal economy, complete laissez-faire, hands-off approach to finance, then you'll have a very tough punishment structure, a very retributive criminal justice system. On the other hand, Nicola Lacey's work shows that if you have a traditional collectivist welfare state, let's imagine the Scandinavian countries here, then you'll stick to a rehabilitative, which is really hard to say, model for your criminal justice structure as a whole compared to other states. You will stick with rehabilitating offenders after an offense. There's a correlation here that's built up through history between economics and punishment. This is interesting when it comes to counter-radicalization, because that correlation, it doesn't seem to apply to counter-radicalization. No matter what economic foundation you have for your state, at least in the 40 countries we're looking at, you have some degree of counter-radicalization policy. Be it more, be it less, there is no strict distinction between, a neoliberal state has this much and a welfare state has this much. That correlation is out of the window. There are things we can lean on in criminology to try and explain this, things about the development of risk-based policy, the development of punitive strategies that try and intervene in advance, but these are specifically tied to neoliberal explanations of why risk comes into play. Okay, I've got your message, Raquel. Noted. We can only go so far with those models because we have two main problems with understanding counter-radicalization as neoliberal. First of all, these models of criminology have never yet been applied to counter-terrorism. We're trying it. It's going to take 5 years. But the assumption, can't be held until it's been tested. Secondly, the welfare state countries, they have considerable counter-radicalization programs going on. So there's evidence, right there in our faces that this is not so simple as to say that this is a neoliberal strategy, that it's informed by neoliberal priorities and discourse, because very different types of state use these programs. So what is this? Where does this idea come from that is so significant that it's broken this trajectory in criminology where certain regimes have certain punishment strategies or criminal justice systems? So in the about 30 seconds I've got left, I can give you a little anecdote about what we're finding so far. We're 6 months into a 5-year project, so this is ongoing research. We're finding that, if you only look for the term radicalization, then yes, you only find the history of this idea coming from 2003. Obviously, that's not satisfactory. It comes from somewhere. If you look at this idea of intervening in advance as an urban security crime prevention policy, then you will find it going for as far back as the 70s in Western Europe, where neoliberal states in particular gave up on rehabilitation and needed some other way to prevent crime, and they moved to anticipatory kind of community safety programs. So you can go that far, but that still doesn't really explain why left-wing welfare states do it. If you go further back, it gets really interesting, and you can find this idea all the way back, weirdly enough, with the foundation of the United Nations and its crime prevention program, and an idea called social defense. And in the 50s, where we're finding this, the 40s and the 50s, we have some very interesting genealogical research that shows this idea as a liberatory left-wing idea. Weirdly enough, it pops up in Tito's Yugoslavia quite significantly in almost modern form, as local boards, and this will sound familiar to anyone that works on Prevent, local boards with multi-agency structures that identify who might become involved in crime in the future and then give them a packaged response to make them less vulnerable to becoming dangerous. So we have a very complicated history behind this idea that is moving between left and right-wing types of economic structure. I can't tell you what the significance of this is yet, apart from, isn't genealogy wonderful? And isn't it great to rethink counterterrorism using critical methods, looking its link to economic structures, but also to go really, really deep into the complexity and say, okay, if we don't just associate this with the word radicalization, where does it come from? It turns out this is a really, really old idea that keeps getting remade and changed. I'm well over time. Thank you for your patience. That's all I've got. I will stop talking now.
Thank you, Charlotte. So now we go for our podcaster in the house, Sondre.
Yeah, I hope you guys can hear me. Listening to Charlotte is always great, and it just makes me realize that, my God, do I miss those, physical meetings and conferences that we can have, and we should have had in Newcastle and also in Malta, I think it was. So, I look forward to meeting up with you guys sometime soon. That would be awesome. It's also great because, from the get-go, Richard and the others that sort of came up with this crazy idea of CTS always imagine it as a broad church, and I think that's also evident in the stuff that we're talking about today with Richard, with Charlotte, and then obviously I'm gonna turn it to a bit different side, maybe the delusional side, which Richard would critique me for, because I'm one of those hopeless academics who think and try to sort of do something within the state, the big bad S word. I'm not entirely naive about this approach, but it's something that I've been worked at for quite some time, and I think it also comes out of what Charlotte just said. We're talking about the states, but we have this range of different states, and like, how do we get these differences or similarities between welfare states or the Scandinavian states, but other perhaps more clearly neoliberal states, which is really fascinating. And one of the reasons that I stuck to my research is this quote from Horkheimer. I've sort of left a bit of Horkheimer when I wrote my book, and I went to another German, namely Max Weber. But Horkheimer has this beautiful quote in his in his famous essay, when he says that to give voice to what one knows, and thereby perhaps to avert new terror, remain the right of a man who's still really alive. And so that quote sort of stuck with me, and I guess you can interpret it different ways. The one that I interpret is that I tried in my own research to create a CTS model, just synthesize it. You can agree with it or agree with it, but I tried to take some of the key knowledge, insights from CTS based on the idea that what can we do to offer alternatives. And this is also based in one key insight, I think, that stuck with CTS from the get-go again. Jackson or Richard wrote it in 2009, Toros and Gunning, but also Herring. And they pointed out the need to bring about concrete utopias out of the fissures and contradictions of existing structures. And so, I think that still has a role. And I don't think, when we try to rethink counterterrorism, I'm not sure if we have explored or exhausted that potential or that possibility. And one way that I tried to do it is that through my CTS model, I applied it to Norway. I could see that a bunch of the stuff that we talk about in CTS was evident or already latent in the Norwegian approach traditionally. This has changed a fair bit in recent years, but I'm talking traditionally. So one of the, and I thought, maybe that's a fissure in counterterrorism. Maybe there's a fissure there that we can sort of look at. And one of the things is that when I interviewed Norwegian diplomats and people that work with terrorism and in Sri Lanka and Colombia, they didn't talk about terrorism per se, or as an ontologically stable fact, but they had this notion of national terrorism, which was local or to that conflict. And so they did not try to extrapolate it and take it abroad to other contexts. Sri Lanka, the case of Sri Lanka was the case of Sri Lanka. They didn't, the LTTE did not represent the FARC or ETA or IRA. And isn't that like, you know, some of the things that we try to critique and bring forward in, you know, with social constructed reality and the relational ontology without talking about it? And I could see that, you know, some people have talked about this in Norway and they have approached conflicts with that approach. And so that gives me a bit of hope to see that in this traditional peace diplomacy context, which is not perfect, but there are these fissures and these openings for this emancipatory potential. So when we, so I guess my main takeaway for this roundtable, or my main message, is just that we also need to try and explore that further. Like personally, I would like to try and, you know, I'm going to shamelessly plug my own model here, but you know, to try and do that with other countries as well, and see, is it possible to detect further fissures, and in that way sort of build an empirical case that says, okay, we are being told that terrorism is this exceptional threat, and we can only deal with it with exceptional measures, unless we can show that actually in various countries we've actually dealt with similar issues, but in a more normal political context. And so that's sort of the way that I would like to see more engagement in CTS, in trying to find those fissures and then build sort of this empirical case, and then try and bring that to, you know, policymakers. And this might be the Don Quixote, you know, approach, and I'm fighting windmills and, you know, whatever, but as I said, guided by that insight from Horkheimer, and I really do believe it. I really do believe, I really do agree with Horkheimer, and I really do agree with Marx that the point is to change the world. And in that sense, you have to do, you know, that research, but there's also, I think, this threshold to step over and actually say, how are we going to do things? I find it incredibly hard sometimes myself when people ask, you know, are we going to do the non-violent route? How do you envision it? That can be quite difficult, but I think we need to muster the courage to, and the research, and then try and find as many fissures and cracks as possible. And Charles' work there with the radicalization is one of them. And I think maybe analyzing states' counterterrorism approach, you know, you could use my model. I would appreciate it. If you come up with a better model, I mean, that's totally fine. That's, you know, the point is just to try and change it. And yeah, so I mean, that's my only, you know, takeaway, trying to find these or only message, trying to find these different ways. And I think it is possible to find these fissures, and it's been a priority for CTS. So I say, let's keep it a priority and make that one of these multi-pronged attacks on a counterterrorism approach or counter paradigm that just doesn't work. We all agree on that. It's been a colossal failure since 2001, and we need to change it. How? There are different ways, and what I like about, and this is my last thing about CTS, is just that we have all these different avenues that we try to change things, and things need to be changed. So, you know, I get this message about the time to wrap up. So that's my wrap up. You know, nothing more.
Thank you, Sondre. And now we have Harmonie.
Unmute yourself. Hello, everyone. It's as I said on Twitter, it's fantastic to have a Zoom call with so many people you love. It's really super. It makes me very happy. But that's not what I'm here to say. So to very briefly, and this is not what I'm going to say, but I think it was interesting what Sondre was saying and working with the state, because I think I'm probably, to a certain degree, one of the people within CTS who's probably been most vocal about my work with the state and my reasons for doing so. As time goes by, I do realize the amount of subtle co-optation that I have been drawn in by, and it's extraordinary to see it on yourself. It is quite a scary process, and the need to be constantly vigilant, because your framing sort of subtly moves and you don't even realize it's happening. It is personally quite staggering and very, very scary at times. So I would say that very, very briefly. But that's not what I wanted to say. I wanted to make a little, very, very brief provocation, which is to ask the question of whether we are reaching a stage, I would say, particularly in large Western, more Anglo-Saxon, so the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand less because it's an outlier. But we're reaching a stage where I wonder whether the state still needs CT in counterterrorism to justify its program of violence. So what I mean by this is that for a long time, I think, and this links to what Richard was saying before, the reason why a lot of us study terrorism and counterterrorism is because we're interested in state violence. We're interested in various ways of direct structural and cultural violence in which the state abused power. That's what has brought many of us to, I think, where we are today. And CT was a blanket, before 9/11, but particularly in the post 9/11 world, was a blanket that the state used to justify a whole series of violent practices that they carried out for a series of economic, social, cultural reasons, which are racist, which are gendered, which are, you know, and we've done all this, we've looked at all this. Now, my question is, have we reached a stage of degradation to a certain degree, that's not a great word, but, you know, of sort of downfall to a certain degree of international norms that is such that the state no longer needs that blanket anymore? That the state feels completely, well, not completely, but at least slowly moving towards the possibility of saying these things out loud without hiding them behind counterterrorism, which means that these policies are no longer within that, underneath that counterterrorism blanket. And we look, when we keep looking under that counterterrorism blanket, we're not necessarily finding the violence that we are really interested in, because that violence is either explicit or has been moved to another blanket. So there's one blanket, sorry, I'm talking about blankets, but I think you know what I mean. My imagery is, the blanket I'm interested in to a certain degree is the one of counter-migration, right? So this is something that is really not spoken about very much, and certainly not in the press. I think it's more spoken about in policy circles. But it's that move that goes from saying, we are scared of people coming because there may be terrorists in amongst them, to we are just scared of people coming, full stop. We just don't want them. So anybody, regardless of their intention, regardless of whether they're linked to a terrorist movement, is a threat just by their very existence. And to a certain degree, that transition empties out counterterrorism of that very violence that we're interested in, that we are studying, right? And so I begin to wonder whether, to a certain degree, we need to, I mean, and this is linked to also what Richard was saying before, we need to look beyond what is under counterterrorism and what fits into the state definition of counterterrorism, because a lot of those state practices and those violent practices have moved elsewhere, or are just obvious, you know, they're just being spoken openly and clearly set out in laws, in policies, and no longer justified as, well, we need to do this because we need to protect ourselves from terrorists. We just want to do it, full stop, because we don't like foreigners, because we don't like brown people, because we don't like women, because we don't like queers, etc., 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 right? And that for me is an even scarier world to a certain degree, maybe, than the world of counterterrorism that we have witnessed in the last 20 years. And the question becomes, what do we do then? What do we study then? And should we, to a certain degree, we had a long debate in critical terrorism studies on whether we should maintain the term terrorism or not, right? Particularly in the beginning. This was a very, very important question that we struggled with a lot, because we felt we were sustaining the terrorism discourse. We were not really, we were doing something normatively wrong. But now, to a certain degree, I think it's more a question of analysis, right? Are we missing that violence that we're interested in by focusing primarily on counterterrorism, and do we need to expand that into other state policies? I think I'm actually under time. On time?
You're good. Thank you so much,
Okay.
Harmonie. Okay, so now we have Yannis.
Right. Hello from South Korea. Good evening from South Korea. For full disclosure, I haven't, well, I was going to say I haven't prepared. I prepared quite a lot of stuff, but because I already live with two terrorists, one 3-year-old and another one 1-year-old, and I also have a counter-terrorism co-boss, it's all been somewhere messed up, and you know, I abandoned any effort. But I have a few thoughts, both from what I was trying to gather to make some sense, but also from what Richard and Charlotte and Sondre and Harmonie were saying, and also what was raised in some of the questions. I know Raquel said we are here to talk about reimagining counterterrorism, not CTS. But to a certain extent, I'm very uncomfortable about this. I don't think this is something that can be done as easily, and I'll explain what I mean. In one of the last papers that I published, one reviewer's comment that stuck with me was when I was writing about emancipation and emancipatory approaches and so on. The reviewer's comment was, well, you talk a lot about this, but surely what you actually need to talk about is resistance. And hearing Richard's keynote, it might have been him. I don't know if it was him who reviewed the paper, but the comment was precisely that. You need to start talking about resistance as a step before emancipation. And I think, I'm not trying to enrage or outrage anybody, but I think that this is the state that CTS has found itself for ever since the beginning. Okay, I'm saying again, no disrespect to anybody. And I'm saying no disrespect to anybody because I don't think that says as much about what CTS is, who is it, or what is it trying to do. I think this says more about who it is faced, who it is opposing most, and how strongly this power or these structures of power are, how severely rooted their feet are, and how difficult it is for scholars like us or scholars in general who swim or trying to swim against the current, right? So in that sense, as Richard said, we have to find a way to revolutionize the revolution. I think this is where it ties in. What I'm trying to say ties in very much with Richard's comment about that, that we need to find a way of successfully completing that resistance before turning it into emancipation. And this, just like Charlotte insinuated and just like Harmonie just spelled out, this needs to go beyond the state. Because we are all part of the state. The state is us, and the state are the people next to us. And the mentalities of the state are not just top down. A lot of the mentalities of the state and a lot of the behaviors of the state are bottom up, if you look at it. Okay, and this again goes back to what Sondre was saying. It's not really an idealist. It's not really a utopianist thing to think that we can change the state or that it is a shame to work with the state to change certain things. If you don't do that, then how do you expect change to happen? Okay. Now this is the comment with regards to CTS. Moving on from there to CT more strictly or more purely. We keep on, it leaves me, every semester I'm surprised with my students. And again, being in South Korea, I'm not as well connected with colleagues. I'm not as well connected with the kind of stimulating conversations that we used to have when I was in Europe or when I was in the West. So partly I'm very thankful to COVID because now I have access to each and every one of your brains that I didn't have until now. But I keep on getting very surprised every semester with my students because I try to instigate this conversation that just like terrorism is about politics, which is the kind of point that usually starts a critical conversation about terrorism, that we need to remind to people that this is all about politics rather than just simply violence or psychopathy. Counterterrorism is very much about politics as well. And our conversations and our comments so far are showing precisely that. If you want to subdue somebody in a political fashion, in a political way, if you want to exterminate the politics of your opponents, especially nowadays, you just have to brand them terrorists, and this will stick, and this will help getting rid of them, right? But I think for a counter-terrorism, any counter-terrorism scheme or program to be effective, it kind of needs to use terrorism as a mirror. And by that, I mean the political side. The politics behind terrorism should be the guiding force of the politics behind counterterrorism. It shouldn't be, as is usually the case, as we have seen throughout the years in numerous cases, whether Sondre referred to the four most prominent cases, the FARC, ETA, IRA, and LTTE, but in numerous other cases, a lot of counterterrorism programs are just a way of annihilating your opponent, an opportunity for the state to annihilate the opponents, which from a peace and conflict studies point of view is neither peace inducive nor conflict reducing. I think I'll leave it there as I'm seconds away from running out of time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Yannis. And now we have our last two roundtable presenters, Maéva and Hanna.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you for inviting me to participate in the roundtable. Both Hanna and I are going to talk about work we've done for a volume on the politics of recognition that you see on screen. As we come to this topic a bit from the side, I will provide some context on recognition, non-recognition of armed non-state actors and how it might intersect with counterterrorism. And Hanna will then illustrate this with insights from the Lebanese Hezbollah. So yeah, the concept of recognition, some of you are familiar with, is very prominent in political philosophy and theory. Not so much in peace and conflict studies. Recognition is conceived basically as a relational process by which basic human and social needs for self-esteem and self-respect is fulfilled. Conversely, misrecognition can be characterized as the deliberate withholding or withdrawal of recognition through which a group becomes socially subordinated. The marginalization of social groups is seen as a cause of conflict within society insofar as they would struggle for recognition in order to be treated as full members of society whose participation is equally important. Theories of recognition have found much reception in international political theory, not so much in peace and conflict studies, and this is for us quite interesting because while ANSAs present diverse political motives, structures, resources, and are involved in different actor and conflict constellations, from civil wars to transnational armed conflicts, they have in common an asymmetric power position and are submitted to the recognition regime of the time. By recognition regime, drawing on Ringmar's work, we mean a global template which establishes normative constraints to recognition claiming and recognition granting. In the volume, Hensel and Schlichter argue that there is a sharp contrast between the recognition regime of the 60s, 70s, and that of nowadays. The global time of decolonization was a comparatively favorable regime for recognition claiming, so they argue. ANSAs were granted recognition more easily for their participation in liberation struggles, whereas the current regime is characterized by the disqualification of ANSA's political agendas based on the actions they use. So Dudoué also argues in the volume that recognition claims are suppressed under the counterterrorism norm. While this is not an entirely new phenomenon, as the LTT in Sri Lanka or the PKK in Turkey were already labeled as terrorist organizations in the 90s, the 80s and the 90s, this practice reached a transnational scope with the global war on terror and is indeed a recurring feature across the volume's case studies. Alice, maybe you can move the PowerPoint forward. Yeah, a bit forward still. As could be expected, this regime affects disproportionately those Ansars who claim to represent Muslim communities. For example, the Ansars claiming to represent the Uyghurs in China have been negatively impacted by ISIS' repeated declarations that it had supporters as far as China, with increased repression by the Chinese government. But not only is it harder for recent Ansars to be cast as anything else than terrorist organizations, older Ansars have been misrecognized under this norm as well since the early 2000s, such as the aforementioned FARC in Colombia. So labeling practices have far-reaching impacts beyond the very organizations they target. They affect the way in which the majority population, as well as third parties, perceive an Ansar's struggle and its responsibility in the conflict. Now, how do these misrecognition practices in the global war on terror interplay? Well, they do so, I think, in a number of partly contradictory ways. First, unknown state actors labeled terrorists have less chance to be recognized under the present recognition regime, and it has enabled state actors to increasingly ignore and disqualify Ansar's recognition claims, at least as long as the label is not reversed, as we've now slowly seen in the Colombian case. Second, the ensuing misrecognition reinforces the risk of conflict escalation and the likelihood of reverting to terrorist tactics, which might mean that Ansar's misrecognition work as counterterrorism self-fulfilling prophecy. Further, states may see an opportunity in this to muzzle non-state actors further. We've seen, for instance, the securitization of further conflict parties under the slogan, they are as bad as terrorist organizations, and or civil society organizations. So in the volume, we have a great chapter on Nigeria, in which Michael talks about the securitization of Igbo non-state actors, which are not using violent tactics in Nigeria. And third, there can be, I think, a simultaneity of the countering the terrorists discourse and the strategy of recognizing the Ansar on a case-by-case basis, which makes this a bit schizophrenic. And I guess the US Taliban peace talks exemplify this trend. The counterterrorism script is maintained, at least in the short run, while some degree of recognition has been granted to the Taliban as an Ansar to transform the conflict. But I guess my question is, what does this contradiction between counterterrorism discourse and a mild recognition strategy mean in the long run? As Yannis and also Véronique Dudoué in our volume stress, labels are sticky, and so how will the future Afghanistan under potential power sharing with the Taliban be treated like? As a terrorist state or back to a pariah state? So it opens a lot of new questions, I guess. On this note, I now pass on to Hanna. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's great being here. I'm actually very grateful to Harmonie's comment earlier on how we might in some countries in the West not even need the counterterrorism label anymore to justify certain types of violence, because I think my contribution here would point to a different development in the MENA region. So as Maéva said, I'm gonna quickly sketch out some of the results that I had in my Hezbollah case study with regard to recognition and the effects of granting recognition, withdrawing it, or misrecognizing actors. So in the chapter, I look at what I call hybrid recognitions. So that means the simultaneous occurrence of recognition and misrecognition practices, as Maéva just mentioned in the end of her introduction. And this simultaneous occurrence of these practices can sometimes also occur by one and the same actor. So I analyze these practices on a domestic, regional, and international level with a focus on Hezbollah's recognition claims. So whom do they want to gain recognition from and for what? But I also looked at the extent to which those potential recognition grantors actually responded to the claims made by Hezbollah. And importantly, in a third step, I also try to show how Hezbollah then again reacts to what it perceives as misrecognition, namely by developing new or emphasizing old recognition claims, by reinterpreting its own identity and role in violent conflicts, and also by withdrawing recognition from actors. And one example for this would be Saudi Arabia, as I will argue in a moment. Now, for the context of this roundtable, I think, as Maéva also already mentioned, misrecognition practices and the reactions to these practices are the most relevant part. So the role of labeling was very prominent in the volume as a whole, but it was particularly prominent in the Hezbollah case study. And I will now focus on the regional level and what I call here for this talk, labeling games. It's a sort of interaction between labeling and counter labeling. So the question, who is actually the real terrorist? Now, there was since the 2010s and especially then starting with 2015, an increasingly hostile anti-Shiite discourse by the Gulf states. So obviously directed against Iran, but also Hezbollah and the more global Shiite threat. And this became particularly prominent in the Yemen, since the Yemen intervention in 2015. Iran was identified as the main threat, and Hezbollah was claimed to be its proxy with also the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Now in 2016, the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Arab League had agreed to list Hezbollah as a terrorist group. And now what is interesting is that Hezbollah started a sort of counter-labeling initiative in its discourse. So Nasrallah's rhetoric had always been critical toward Gulf countries, but a whole new tone was set when the Saudi-led coalition started its military intervention in Yemen. Now, Nasrallah tried to reveal that there was an intimate connection between Wahhabist ideology and Takfirism. So what he calls Takfirism is what we know as Salafi jihadist groups. So he tried to claim that there is basically no difference between Saudi Arabia and actors like ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, etc., in terms of their ideological stance. And by this, Nasrallah aimed on the one hand at establishing that the situations in Yemen and Syria, Iraq could be seen as very similar, where the real enemy in both cases was a child of Wahhabism. And on the other hand, he also tried to put the terrorism label on both Saudi Arabia and Takfirist groups, and thereby sort of countering the narrative that Hezbollah is the terrorist problem and Iran is basically the homeland of terrorism. So why is this important in the study of counterterrorism? First, I would say that these labeling practices reinforce existing cleavages between what is often perceived as a sectarian conflict between Shiites and Sunnis, but which obviously is far more complex. And second, the mutual labeling as terrorists, and I think this connects well to Harmonie's point earlier, allows for legitimizing the use of force in the framework of counterterrorism. And this is something that we can see. So in a way, new forms of state violence, for instance, external military interventions by Arab authoritarian regimes, are actually justified within the framework of counterterrorism. And this may be used to in the context of regional competitors, also to frame geopolitical interests in, I would say, an acceptable fashion that is accessible also to Western states and to a more or less Western global audience that needs to at least tolerate or even support these interventions. So eventually I would say that these spirals of misrecognition increasingly escalate conflicts and contribute to more violence. And what Maéva mentioned earlier is that calling an actor a terrorist, which we frame in the volume as misrecognition, precludes the possibility to engage this actor in a non-violent way. So thank you very much.